The snow came down in curtains the morning they nailed the notice to the post outside Creel's general store. Elva didn't see it right away. She was carrying 2 pails of water from the well, her boots punching through the icy crust with every step, her breath coming out in short white clouds. The baby was strapped to her chest under her coat, 4 months old and already too heavy for a woman who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. She felt his warmth against her sternum and kept walking. It was old Mrs. Fenn who stopped her. "Girl." The woman's voice was flat. Not unkind, but flat the way a door is flat when it's closed. "You'd better read that." Elva set down the pails and read it. The words didn't rearrange themselves, no matter how many times her eyes moved across them. Pursuant to the outstanding debt of $112 held against the estate of the late Corwin Aldgate, all property, chattels, and dependents therein are hereby subject to public auction. Date: Friday, November 14th. Time: 9 o'clock in the morning. Dependents therein. She looked down at the baby. He was asleep, his cheek pressed warm against her collarbone. Corwin had been dead 6 weeks. She had known about the debt for 4. What she hadn't known, what the banksman hadn't told her when he came to the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floorboards, was that a debt of that size could reach far enough to touch a child. But here it was in writing, and writing didn't lie the way men did. Elva had come to the territories 3 years ago, from a town in Ontario, so small it didn't appear on any map she'd ever seen. She had come because Corwin asked her to, and she had loved him then with the kind of love that doesn't ask many questions. He was broad, shouldered, and laughed easily and smelled like pine resin. She had thought those things were enough. They weren't, as it turned out. Corwin was a man who could charm a crowd at supper and disappear for 3 days without explanation. A man who borrowed money with a handshake and forgot about it by morning. He wasn't cruel, he just had a way of living, as though consequent was something that happened. To other people, then last September, he went out to check the trap line and didn't come back. They found him 2 days later, at the base of a ravine. The horse had spooked at something, that was all anyone could say for certain. Elva had buried him herself, because there wasn't money for a proper funeral. She had wrapped him in the good wool blanket, the one her mother had sent from home, and stood at the grave until her feet went numb and the baby started crying and she had to go inside. She named the baby Fenn. She had been saving the name since before she arrived in the territories, tucked away like something breakable, and Corwin had never asked about it now. She used it without asking anyone's permission. Friday came with a sky the color of old pewter. Elva stood on the steps of the trading post in her best dress, which was not very good, with Fenn bundled against her chest, and her jaw set in a way that people who knew her would have recognized as the thing she did when she was frightened but refused to show it. There were perhaps 30 men gathered in the mud of the main street. Some she knew. Most she didn't. The auctioneer was a man named Crale, thin, quick-eyed, the kind of man who made a living off other people's worst days. Crale started with the furniture, then the tools, then the mule. He got $108. He needed 112. Right then, Crale said, and his eyes moved to Elva the way eyes move to the last thing on the table. The estate also carries 2 dependents, a woman, Elva Aldgate, age 26, and a male infant, approximately 4 months. These 2 will be placed in the care of the highest bidder, who will also assume responsibility for the remaining debt of $4. Someone in the crowd laughed. Not a funny laugh, the kind that fills space when no one knows what else to do. Elva kept her eyes straight ahead and her hand flat against Fenn's back. The first bid came from a man she recognized, Tedder, who ran the second mill outside of town. He was 55 and had already buried 2 wives. He bid $8. Another man bid 10. She didn't know him. A third voice she didn't turn to look for bid 14. The wind came down off the mountain like something with a purpose and cut straight through her dress. Fen stirred and made a small sound, and she pressed her palm firmer against his back. It's all right, she thought, though she wasn't sure she believed it. It's going to be all right. Then something changed in the crowd. She felt it before she saw it. A shift. The way 30 men's attention moves when it all goes in the same direction at once. She turned her head. A man had ridden in from the North Road on a horse, the color of river mud. He was big, not in the way that some men are big in towns, soft and wide, but in the way that mountains are big, like the size came from something that wasn't trying. He wore a coat of rough canvas and elk hide, and he had the kind of face that didn't apologize for anything. Ice in his beard, rifle across his back. Eyes the particular grey of sky before a real storm. He didn't hurry. He rode to the edge of the crowd and stopped and looked at Crail the way a man looks at a problem he's already decided how to solve. "What's owed?" he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Crail blinked. "Sir, the current bid stands at 14. What's owed on the estate? $4. The man reached into his coat and produced a worn leather pouch. He counted out $4 in coin and held them out across the crowd toward Crail without dismounting. "Debt's cleared," he said. "Action's done." No one argued. That was the part Elva would think about later. That 30 men stood in the mud, and not one of them argued. There was something feel like a poor way he sat on that horse that crayed argument feel. Of anyone's time pocketed the coins. The man finally looked at her, not the way the other men had looked at her, not assessing or pitying or calculating. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand, careful and without judgment. "My name's Graff," he said. "I've got a cabin 12 miles north. It's dry and it's got a stove and there's food enough for winter." He paused. "You don't have to come, but if you've got nowhere else to go, you can." Elva looked at the muddy street. She looked at Tedder, still standing in the crowd with his arms crossed. She looked down at Fen, who was awake now, blinking slowly at the grey sky with his solemn, dark eyes. She had nowhere else to go. That was simply the truth. "All right," she said. The 12 miles north were the longest she'd ever ridden. Graff gave her his horse and walked. She asked him twice if he wanted to ride, and he said no both times without elaborating, and after that she stopped asking. Fen slept through most of it, which was a mercy. The cabin appeared out of the tree line, like it had grown there. Timber walls gone dark with age, a stone chimney, a lean-to on the south side with a milk goat inside. She could hear the animal before she saw it, a low, persistent sound against the wind, a woodpile stacked to the eaves. An elk hide stretched on a frame beside the door. It was not beautiful, but it was solid in a way that the house she and Corwin had built together never quite managed to be. Graff lifted her down from the horse, before she could attempt it herself, and then stepped back immediately like he was aware of the distance between them and wanted to maintain it. He carried her one bag inside and set it by the door. "Fire's low," he said. "I'll get it up." He did, and then he went back outside. Elva stood in the middle of the cabin and looked around. There was a table, 2 chairs, a rope bed in the corner with a wool blanket, a shelf of canned goods and dried meat, an axe by the door, a Bible with a cracked spine on the windowsill, which surprised her. She hadn't placed him as a Bible man, but then she'd known him less than 4 hours. There was nothing soft in the room, nothing decorative. It was the home of a man who had lived a long time without anyone to live for. She found a wooden crate and lined it with her spare petticoat and laid Fen down in it and stood there for a moment looking at him. "Well," she said to him quietly, "this is where we are." Fen studied the ceiling with great seriousness. Graff slept in the lean to the first 3 nights without being asked. She didn't tell him he could sleep in the cabin. He didn't ask. On the 4th morning, she left a bowl of porridge on the table before she had him come in, and when she came back from washing Fen, it was gone, and the bowl had been rinsed and set by the door. They learned each other slowly, the way animals learn, sideways, without direct confrontation. Through small signals, she learned that he was up before dawn every morning without exception. that he could fix anything with wire and patience, that he had a habit of standing in the doorway in the evening, looking north at the mountains, with his coffee going cold in his hand, and that this was not sadness exactly. It was something older than sadness, some long accommodation he'd made with solitude. He learned that she was not a woman who cried easily, but could be undone by small kindnesses, that she was meticulous with what little she had, stitching Fenn's blankets with tiny careful stitches when she thought no one was watching, that she sang to the baby at night in a low voice, that she tried to make inaudible, but wasn't. One evening in the 3rd week, she came in from checking the goat to find that Graff had built a proper cradle from spruce wood and set it beside the stove without any announcement. No bow on it, no ceremony, just the cradle, sitting there, solid and perfectly proportioned and sanded smooth. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, but she moved the crate out and laid Fenn in the cradle that night, and he slept better than he had since they'd arrived. The trouble came in December. She had known something was wrong before it happened. The goat had been restless for 2 days, and Graff had started sleeping in the cabin. By then, on a pallet near the door, and she'd noticed him lying awake those nights staring at the rafters when he thought she was asleep. She asked him about it once. He said, "Don't worry," which was not an answer, but she let it be because she'd learned by then that his not answers often meant "I'm handling it." She was heating water for Fenn's bath when they came. She didn't know their faces, but she knew the type. Men who moved through places like this on the edge of the law, doing work that other men paid for and then forgot about. The one in front was called Renner, she found out later. He had a scar from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and he stood in the doorway like he owned the cabin and everything in it. "Graff owes us money," Renner said. "From the summer, we've come to collect." Graff said nothing. He was standing between Renner and the cradle, where Fenn lay sleeping. "There's no money here," Elva said, because silence sometimes makes things worse. Renner looked at her with a kind of flat appraisal that made her stomach go cold. "There's other ways to settle a debt," he said. What happened next was fast and ugly, and not something she could have predicted. Renner reached for her, and Graff, not quickly, not with any drama, the way a large animal moves when it's decided to stop waiting. He put himself between Renner and Elva with one step, and the blow he landed sent Renner into the doorframe hard enough to crack the wood. The second man had a knife. She heard it. A particular sound, not loud, that she understood even before she turned. Graff made no sound at all. He kept his feet. He put the second man down in the snow, outside the door with one hand, while the other hand pressed against his left side, and then he was in the doorway again, facing Renner, until Renner looked at the 2 men on the ground and decided that the debt wasn't worth it after all. They heard the horses leave. Graff stood in the doorway for a moment, longer than necessary. Then he turned around and looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. He wasn't. The knife had gone in below his ribs on the left side, not deep, but deep enough, and she'd seen enough of cuts and cold to know what happened when a wound wasn't dealt with properly. She made him sit. He sat, which told her something. She had no real training. What she had was observation, steadiness, and 4 months of keeping a newborn alive in the wilderness, which required both of those things. In quantities most people didn't know they possessed. She boiled the needle and the thread. She poured whiskey on the wound, and watched his jaw tighten, and said nothing sympathetic, because she had the feeling sympathy would make things harder for him. She worked by firelight. He was quiet through most of it. Halfway through, she heard him make a sound, not of pain, she thought, but of something more complicated, and she glanced up and found him watching her with those grey eyes that had looked at her on the main street of that town, like she was a problem he'd already decided how to solve. "You didn't have to do that," she said, because it was true. What you did out there. You didn't have to. I know, he said. They were the same 2 words he'd said about the cradle, and they meant the same thing. She tied off the last stitch and sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was pale under the weathering. He needed sleep and broth and probably a week of stillness that he wouldn't grant himself. From the cradle, Fen made a small wakeful sound. Graff's eyes went to the cradle immediately. He all right? She almost smiled, almost. He's fine. He's just awake. Oh, he paused. Does he need anything? He'll need milk soon. Graff nodded slowly, as if this was important information he was storing carefully. Then, quietly, goat's in the lean-to. Didn't get to her tonight with all of. He stopped, looked at her. Did you get the milk? She did smile then. She couldn't help it. It arrived on her face before she could stop it. Not a polite smile, a real one, the kind she hadn't produced in long enough that the muscles felt strange. Not yet, she said. I can. He started to push himself upright. You absolutely cannot, she said. I'll go. You sit. He sat. She could feel his eyes on her back as she pulled on her coat. Outside, the night was brilliantly cold and perfectly clear. The stars over the mountains were the kind she'd never seen in Ontario. Too many of them, almost reckless, spread across the sky as though someone had knocked over a lamp. The goat butted her head against Elva's knee the moment she came through the lean-to door, impatient as ever. I know, Elva told her. I know. Me too. She milked the goat by feel in the dark, and carried the pail back inside and heated it over the stove, and brought Fen a cup and watched him drink it with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Graff had fallen asleep in the chair. He looked, asleep, like a different person. Not smaller, exactly, but less fortified. The lines of his face settled differently, without the watchfulness. He was still pressed against his side with one hand even in sleep, unconsciously, protecting the stitches. She brought a blanket from the bed and laid it over him. She stood there for a moment after. Not quite ready to woman. She had learned to be. She did not let herself build things in her mind that might not hold. She had learned that too, the hard way, but standing in that cabin in the dark, with Fen warm and fed in his cradle, and the stove burning low and even, and the mountains holding the world still outside, she thought about what it would mean if this was something that lasted. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything she couldn't afford to break. The winter did not soften, but Elva did. Or not softened precisely. She'd been a river that moved around obstacles. She began slowly to move toward things instead. She started sitting at the table in the evenings with her mending, while Graff sat across from her with the knife he was always sharpening, and the 2 of the milk talked about. Nothing important production. The weather coming in from the north, whether the creek would freeze solid or just at the edges, but small talk, she'd learned, was never really about what it was about. One evening in late January, when the snow outside was so deep it had reached the lower edge of the window and the cabin was sealed close as a held breath, Graff put down the knife and looked at her directly. Something he rarely did, and said, "Do you miss Ontario?" She considered it honestly. "I miss my mother," she said. "I miss knowing where things are. I miss a winter that ends." He nodded. "Do you miss," she started, then stopped. She didn't know what to ask. She didn't know what was behind him. He'd never said, "I miss having something worth coming home to," he said quietly. She looked at her mending. He looked at the knife. Neither of them said anything else. But Fen, from his cradle, made a small decisive sound, as if commenting on the situation. Graff made a noise that might have been a laugh. The first she'd heard from him. "He's got opinions," he said. "He always has." In March, the first thaw came. It wasn't real yet, more of a suggestion, a softening around the edges of things. But the light was different. It came in through the window at a new angle and fell across the table in a way that made even the rough wood look possible. Graff was outside with the axe when Elva put Fen on the blanket on the floor and sat down beside him and said, seriously to a 4-month-old baby. "I think we might be all right here." Fen grabbed her finger with his whole fist. His grip was getting stronger. She heard the axe stop. A moment later the door opened and Graff came in and stamped the snow from his boots and looked at her on the floor with the baby, and stopped for a second, the way he sometimes stopped, taking in the scene like he was still surprised to find it here. "Coffee's on," she said. "Good," he said. He hung up his coat and his hat. He sat down on the floor, on the other side of Fen, a motion that should have looked strange for a man of his size, but didn't, somehow. He looked at the baby with the grave attention he brought to most things, and Fen looked back at him with equal seriousness. "He's going to need a hat," Graff said, "when he can sit up. Wind's worse in spring than winter on this ridge." Elva looked at him. "You know how to make a hat?" "No, neither do I." "Then we'll figure it out," he said. She looked back at Fen. She was smiling again. It was becoming something she did without thinking, which was strange, and also not strange at all. Outside, the snow was still 3 feet deep. There were months of cold ahead. The debt was cleared, the wound was healed, and the goat was making noise in the lean-to because she always was. And in a cabin 12 miles north of a town where everything had almost gone very wrong, Elva Aldgate sat on the floor beside a man who didn't use many words, and trusted that to be enough, and thought that the space between almost and all right was smaller than she'd ever understood. Fen grabbed Graff's finger without being invited. Graff let him hold it.